So let me start. Hello, everybody. Hello, our panelists who are here from IsraAid, which we'll talk to and introduce in a couple of minutes. And thank you all of you who are joining us on the Zoom call or via Facebook Live. Good afternoon here in DC, but good evening, I'm sure, to many of our friends in Europe and Israel who are listening into us. Today, I'm not sure who knows or not, it's something I learned. It's World Humanitarian Day. It was declared by the UN to celebrate and to bring to light and I guess introduce to people, like myself and others, the work of humanitarian workers, of volunteers all around the world, of people who, whether paid or voluntarily, go to difficult places, go to areas of crisis, go to areas that experienced natural disasters or other disasters, and we'll talk about the different kinds, and go out of their way and, pick themselves up and go out to help people. We use the word heroes a lot with COVID-19s, and we suddenly find out that doctors, that nurses, that assistance workers, that health workers, are there, people we might not notice or not think about on our day-to-day until we hit a crisis and we understand the roles they play in our lives and in the world. And I think, I appreciate this day because I had the honor of pleasure, and we'll talk about it later, of encountering IsraAid, its workers, its staff, and its volunteers in a few places that I served around the world. But I think its story of it's the biggest humanitarian group in Israel, and the biggest Israeli humanitarian group that's doing amazing work around the world. And I'm very grateful that we have the chance here to talk to one of the senior staffers, Rachel Wallace, and to 3 volunteers. Well, I promise you, I'll introduce them to you in a bit. But let's start first with Rachel and IsraAid. Rachel is the Director of Outreach and Engagement in IsraAid. She's worked with us here at the Embassy of Israel in DC on a few projects, and we got to see her even here a couple of times, introducing IsraAid to different audiences. She oversees the community and university partnerships for IsraAid, and with the volunteers we have here, we can see that she's doing a good job. So before we delve into the work of IsraAid and what you do and where, can you tell us a little bit about the organization?
Of course. Thank you very much, Tammy, for that wonderful introduction. It's always a pleasure to work with the Israeli Embassy. My name is Rachel Wallace. I'm the Director of Outreach and Engagement at IsraAid. We are Israel's leading humanitarian aid organization. So often in our community, we hear that Israel is the first on the ground after a big crisis, disaster, health epidemic, refugee situation, whatever it might be. And when you hear that, most of the time, it's actually IsraAid. And when you think of our organization, remember the term FILO, for first in, last out, because most of the time IsraAid is not only the first on scene, but it's also the last to leave. And we not only respond to the immediate emergency needs after a crisis, but also we remain in country for the long term, depending on the situation, sometimes 2 years, 5, even up to 10, to really ensure that we are working together with the community to help them build back even stronger than where they were even prior to a crisis. And we're very fortunate to be representing IsraAid here today because it really embodies some of the most wonderful qualities about our nation of Israel. For example, many of us probably here know that Israel is a very diverse country, and the organization of IsraAid embodies that diversity. It really reflects the diversity of Israel. So for example, we've had Israeli Jews, Israeli Arab Muslims, Israeli Arab Christians, Druze, all on our teams around the world. And also many of us probably know that Israeli expertise and know-how is top-notch in areas like mental health and trauma support and psychosocial support, water, medical, and we bring a lot of that expertise to the partnerships that we form all over the world. And we are very fortunate to have some of our incredible IsraAid ambassadors with us here today, who have been with us in so many unique places responding to crises all over the world. And it's really a privilege to hear and highlight their stories too.
Thank you. I think we have a very short video, right? Just a little bit to show after the photos we saw about IsraAid. That's very, yeah, it sums up a lot of what you do, and we'll definitely delve into it with you, Rachel, and our 3 volunteers that you brought. I'll just say a few words about each. The first one is Deborah Mailman. She's retired after a long career in technology with Microsoft and their operating systems. She delved a little bit into the biomedical world, which is, I think, relevant for what's happening to us these days, with first response defibrillators, among many other projects that she headed. She's been with IsraAid, and we'll hear about it a little bit, responding to Hurricane Dorian in the Grand Bahama, and also in other places, and we'll talk to her a little bit about natural disasters. We have Amir Kashfi with us, who just graduated from UCLA, so yay. And he was he worked in Berlin with refugees, I'm assuming, but we'll hear mostly from Syria, but also Iraq, Afghanistan, and many others. And Rachel, you were talking about long-term projects. So I'm sure with the many millions of refugees we have coming into Europe, we'll hear about that. But it's not just Europe, it's also in South America. And we have Roberto Martinez with us that worked on different IsraAid long-term programs and missions, and especially now with the 1.6 million refugees coming out of Venezuela to Colombia and other neighboring countries. So if I could just delve right in and start, and I'll start with you, Amir. Rachel mentioned it. We saw it in the wonderful photos of the 3 of you talk in the beginning and in the video about Israel's diversity, and from there, the diversity of IsraAid staff and volunteers. Can you tell us a little bit, just, touch on your personal history and how that affected you, or I think probably also assisted you in your work in Germany?
Sorry, you cut out there for a second. Would you mind repeating part of that question?
Yeah, I was just, if you could tell us a little bit about your work in Germany and your personal history and how you came to Israel, and how did that, how it made you feel in that encounter with helping the refugees in Germany, and assisted you, or, how you related to them.
Perfect. Yeah, it was a really moving experience for me to be in Berlin with these refugees. For those that are familiar with the history, you know that around 2014, because of the spread of ISIS and civil war in Syria, civil war in Iraq, spread of Taliban in Afghanistan, there was a real humanitarian crisis in the Middle East that triggered the exodus of millions of refugees to Europe. And when these refugees arrived in Europe, it wasn't a natural disaster in the traditional sense. There was no search and rescue or anything like that, but it was certainly a crisis. And these refugees carried some really profound psychosocial traumas that hindered their integration into German society. And so when IsraAid arrived in Berlin, to help support these refugees, some of the biggest priorities were to work with the most vulnerable in the population to try to promote their integration into German society, whether that's through language skills, whether it's through job training, whether it's through psychosocial trauma support, whether it's through after-school programs for the refugee youth. And when I arrived in Berlin in 2018, like Rachel said, as a first in, last out organization, the acuteness of the crisis may have subsided, but there was still an ongoing effort to try to meet the needs of the community. I'm a Persian Jewish kid in LA, and my parents raised me speaking Farsi. And so when I arrived in Berlin, it was really easy for me to connect with the refugees that had come from Iran and Afghanistan. And I made a couple friends from Tajikistan as well. And working alongside these refugees was a very meaningful experience for me, because I've never been to Iran, but these people had come from the country that my parents came from. And they were the best teachers for bringing me closer to my roots. I mean, I really felt like I was connecting to my own family heritage and background by working with these asylum seekers from the other side of the world. And so to support some of the most meaningful programs with youth, to work on an after-school program with Syrian children who fled unimaginable violence and trauma, something we can't even relate. And to see the grit and the aspirations that these people have to build a better life for themselves and to be a part of that journey and to contribute, given our own family background and given the opportunity of those of us at IsraAid who, each of us has our own story of having been involved with similar issues, whether it's the Arab Israelis on our team that are working with the Arab-speaking refugees, or the volunteers like me that are coming in. It's an amazing opportunity that I had to really connect with some incredible and inspiring people.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And if I was posted in Athens until 2016, and they had the economic crisis, but definitely the Syrian crisis. And Rachel mentioned first in, last out. When the refugees started arriving in Lesbos in September of 2015, IsraAid was there very, very quickly. Manal, an Arab Israeli, headed the team, and they dealt especially with trauma and stuff. But because they were the first ones there, one of the main things they did to help was translation. Because the Greek Coast Guard or the Greek people who came to assist, could not communicate with people coming from Syria and the Middle East, of course, speaking mostly only Arabic. And it was amazing to see how IsraAid volunteers and staff, immediately got on and did double duty. They did what they came there to do, especially with the children. And you mentioned education and, and stress assistance and others, but also even being translators, which, if they weren't there, I don't know, it would have taken, more weeks or more time to address some of the needs of these people. Can you just tell us a little bit more, because I know you were awarded a national prize in Germany by Chancellor Angela Merkel. So can you expand on that a little bit and a bit more about the educational work you did with the youth or children?
This was very exciting. At the time in 2018, the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, had just announced an award, which was going to be given for the second time, to recognize NGOs that were doing meaningful work with the asylum seekers. And at the time, it was only the second time that they were giving the award. And we were recognized in IsraAid very specifically for a project that we were doing with, I believe, Yazidi women who had experienced some serious traumas coming from Syria, and the bridge building initiative that IsraAid had put in place to support these women. And it was a big honor for us because this is a national integration prize that the German government, it's the highest honor that they can bestow upon an NGO once a year to recognize that kind of work. And so it was very, it was really an honor for us to receive that kind of a recognition from the German government. And I really want to emphasize that the honor doesn't just go to IsraAid, because it also goes to these incredible refugees that have done a lot of the legwork themselves in terms of strengthening their own communities. A fundamental value in IsraAid's work is to support communities in a sustainable way so that they can uplift themselves after we're gone. And so that's the lens through which a lot of the work is done. It's how can the refugees, how can the asylum seekers build the infrastructure to support themselves? And one of the best examples of that is that IsraAid hires some of these refugees to join the staff. By the time I arrived in 2018, the majority of the IsraAid team in Berlin was not Israelis. They had gone back to Israel at that point. It was local hires, many of which IsraAid had helped save in the first place. And so the opportunity to work alongside as colleagues with refugees who had experienced, what the same thing that the people they were serving, it was a really incredible experience. One of the most exciting projects that we were working on was the establishment of a fully self-sustaining, almost self-governing refugee camp in partnership with an apartment building. We were working on getting some housing for a group of refugees. Very tough to get refugees out of the camps and into flats, into apartments. And we were working on a project to try to get a community going in an apartment building. And the initiative behind that really speaks to the power of these refugees to take their future into their own hands and to really build what it is they want for themselves. And so through all the programs that we pursued, even the after school program that we were setting up with young teenagers, middle schoolers, refugee youth who have only been in Berlin for a couple years, we were already seeing that they were taking the reins of their programs. They were expressing, where they felt the gaps were in their schooling that they wanted more support with, or what kinds of social issues they were grappling with that they wanted the IsraAid staff to support with. And building that kind of culture of sustainability and following through in a way so that the community will be able to support itself with resilience after IsraAid is gone. That was by far the most inspiring part of the work, because that it's more than just putting a Band-Aid on the issue. You're really creating a long-term sustainable solution. And I think to have the German government recognize that too in a disaster, it's kind of like a disaster industry. Sometimes it seems like there's so many NGOs out in the field. To be recognized, with that kind of distinction was a really big honor for us.
It absolutely is. And yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. If they take it on their own, if the people you're helping are adopting it and doing it, I think it shows that you are on the right track and doing the right things. And hopefully, it will continue, as you said, after IsraAid is almost, let's say, out, or most of its staff is out, and the good work continues. So can we, Roberto, can you tell us a little bit, maybe the similarities, differences, but I think you also have some background that helped you with encountering and working with the refugees out of Venezuela?
Yeah, happy to tell the story of IsraAid, but I want to first take a step back and tell you how amazing the staff and the team that is IsraAid is. I got introduced to IsraAid 3 years ago when I heard Yotam speak, their global CEO, and I was in a room full of seasoned business and political leaders, and I would tell you there were a lot of people in the room with tears in their eyes, because it's such a unique organization that goes around the world and helps out people that they've never known, and it kind of speaks to the ethos of what IsraAid really is. And so I was inspired by that conversation and that talk, and I reached out to IsraAid and I said, how could I be part of your organization? How could I help? Because you spoke to me, your founder spoke to me, and then I met Rachel and Seth, and just an amazing group of individuals. And soon after that, we were introduced to a very unique experience to send some Latino leaders, which we'll hopefully touch on a little bit later. But more to your question about Colombia, the largest migrant challenge in the world is in Venezuela. 4.7 million migrants displaced internally, and the bordering country that happens to be Colombia is taking the majority of these immigrants. And there's a lot of internal displacement as well in Colombia. And so what you have the largest humanitarian crisis happening in South America. And a lot of people did not know about this. And what IsraAid decided to do is raise awareness about this challenge. They obviously were there from the very beginning when this occurred. And so the way you want to see the experience that IsraAid creates in host countries is that they kind of attack it as, what's the first need that these refugees might have? And so it's emergency assistance right away. It's like, how do we help the individuals on the ground immediately? And as you start realizing the way they operate, they're providing this amazing hands-on experience where they're providing emergency relief. And then from there, they kind of work backwards and realize, how can we create a sustainable program to help out not just the parents but the children. And that's really what we saw when we went to Colombia. We saw a concerted effort around multiple touch points in the cities of Colombia, particularly in Barranquilla, where they invested heavily into creating these self-contained, as Amir was saying, where a lot of the local talent that was recruited and hired were the refugees themselves. In other words, empowering the people so they don't feel as if they do not have power to control their own destiny, which is super, I mean, it's just very informative of the way IsraAid operates. And on top of that, how do we create safe spaces for the future of the country of Venezuela, the country of Colombia, by providing these environments for the kids to walk through their challenging experience that they had migrating from home, from very safe, unique communities in Venezuela where they had to be displaced and come over to Colombia. And so what we saw firsthand is the work that they created, creating these amazing clinics, if you will, and psychosocial clinics where you can go there and be able to walk through the traumas that are occurring in your life as a 5-year-old, as a 10-year-old, as a 7-year-old, and realize that you do have power around what's going on in your life, and there is hope. And so that for us was very moving. We brought about 15 to 18 Latino, very specific Latino, and a smaller contingency of non-Latino political, business, and social leaders to have a first-hand experience on A, not just the work that they're doing, but B, raise awareness on this issue that's going on in South America, and hopefully bring that awareness brings a certain amount of volunteers in the form of in-country volunteers. But one of my favorite sayings of IsraAid is live where you stand, right? You don't necessarily have to be in Colombia to help Venezolanos. You don't necessarily have to be in Venezuela to help out IsraAid. You could do it from Los Angeles, from New York, from Chicago, from Tel Aviv, from London, regardless of where you're at. That's very empowering. And knowing that there's outlets there within IsraAid where you can volunteer in different tiers is what really inspires the type of work that they do, and it really keeps me engaged with the work that they're doing in Venezuela and Colombia.
Thank you for that. And I have, I didn't actually, you're, our third volunteer that I didn't introduce. So on your free time when you're not volunteering for IsraAid, you're a national and digital coach for Google. So it's amazing that, and I'm sure your job is very, very demanding, especially in this age of Zoom and internet almost only. So amazing work, and we'll come back to you. And Deborah, if I can ask you, Emil and Roberto spoke about working with refugees and touch about some of the points, especially empowering the refugees themselves and working with the children. In your experience, and you've dealt as far, you came to assist in natural disasters, both in Dominica and in the Grand Bahamas. Can you tell us if this is the way that IsraAid and you worked in those places as well, or some similarities and differences with what you encountered?
Thank you very much. I can echo absolutely everything Amir and Roberto have said. The key point about IsraAid is that we build capacity. We show up first, we leave last, but when we leave capacity. So the things we do are not done by landing hundreds of volunteers onto a country. Now, many NGOs do that, and that's fine. And in times of disasters, you sometimes do need to bring outsiders in. However, IsraAid's philosophy is if you teach the folks on the ground, they learn the ability to take care and then build further. And the example I'll give you is in Dominica. So the hurricane simply flattened that community. Puerto Rico was terribly damaged, and Dominica was probably damaged 3 times worse. And when IsraAid got there, the first thing that needed to be done was first aid. So medical supplies were delivered, water, sanitation, all those things that you could bring in from the outside were delivered. At about the 3-month mark, many of the other NGOs considered their work done and their volunteers left. That's when IsraAid got started. So what IsraAid did was it collaborated with the UNDP, the United Nations Development Project, and a number of the other volunteer organizations. And we found projects that needed to be done. And in IsraAid's case, that was a building project. So IsraAid brought in some engineers and some architects from Israel, and we collaborated. So everything you're going to hear me say is about collaboration. IsraAid never goes in independently. They always go in to see what needs to be done in cooperation. So we collaborated with Digicel, which is the telephone company in Dominica. They were rebuilding the school on Dominica. IsraAid worked with Digicel, and we rebuilt the roofing. So every disaster is different. In Dominica, it was a wind event. On Grand Bahamas, it was a water event that I can talk about. So IsraAid pivots. You never tell an Israeli no. It's just not done.
That's true.
If there's an obstacle, an Israeli finds a way through it. And in this case, we rebuilt roofs. And so the problem we had was there was not a population with that skill set. So what did we do? We developed that population. We provided those skills. We flew to Guadeloupe. We bought all the safety equipment. We brought drills. And then the UN provided us lumber. And so I think you saw one of the pictures in the first slideshow.
With the roof.
Yes. Okay. But notice what you saw on the roof. You saw one IsraAid person, and you saw about 4 or 5 local individuals. They were being trained. So the way we trained them was we had one contractor, we had one skilled carpenter, and we had 2 people who were learning. And so that was the way we approached the project. They would never let me on a roof, trust me. They don't want me on any roof. But what we did was we brought together all the disparate pieces necessary to solve the problem. And that's what IsraAid is all about. We look at a problem, we solve it. If it doesn't work, we pivot it until we come up with a sustainable solution. And then and only then do we look at leaving a community.
And were you in touch after? Were the buildings set up? Were the roofs set up? Do you have any follow-up or contact ongoing?
Absolutely. So what we did, you've got to remember, I came from Microsoft. It's all about data. So what we did was we tracked the work we did. We tracked how much it cost to do each roof. And we left that information in the community. And now they're continuing to do that building work. Not on the same kind of scale because, it's 3 years after it. Folks, unfortunately, their attention goes elsewhere. But that skill is still available in the island. And most importantly, in addition to doing building, IsraAid does all the psychosocial work that Amir and Roberto were talking about. And on Dominica, we worked with schools and we helped build resiliency in the children. So now on the next hurricane, which unfortunately there will be, these children are trained and they know how to respond to a disaster. They know how to improve the work in their own schools. And then that gets carried home to their parents. And then that builds the community with an ability and a capacity, when there are disasters, which because of climate change are going to continue.
Thank you for that. And what you said about continuing work also a few years later. I was in Nepal in 2017 and there I worked with Shira Goldstein. I don't know when worked. I saw her work. Sorry, let's be honest about it. I don't know if she was with you in the Bahamas or.
Yes, I worked with Shira in the Bahamas.
Yeah, amazing person. So what I saw her do in Nepal, to be right, we need to be very, they had a horrible earthquake in 2015. And as I said, 2 or 3 years later, IsraAid was still there. And the projects they were doing, there were 2 projects, and tell me if you can tell us of a similar story. One project was bringing potable water, drinking water to villages that either didn't have infrastructure at all before the earthquake or it was damaged due to the earthquake. And the second one, which I found beautiful on many levels, she works with women growing, making honey, growing bees, making honey, which we all know we need bees, you know, to stay alive, the whole world. But also, of course, for these women, it offered a source of income. And I thought it was beautiful. And some women benefited from both projects. And I thought it was beautiful. And were you doing similar things?
In Dominica, we actually had a bee project. And the neat thing about the honey project, particularly in Dominica, it was also focused on women. It was a collaborative, cooperative. So these women got together and decided how they wanted to split the profits and how they wanted to share the profits. And they also found ways to collaborate on how they wanted to market their products. And it was getting a lot of traction. And bees take several years. So it's these kind of projects that IsraAid invests in that are not quick fixes, which is comparable in the Grand Bahamas. So IsraAid has tons of experience in water, because if you think about Israel, it's a dry country. Every drop of water matters. And in the Bahamas, their water table is very, very thin. So when the hurricane came, it contaminated their water table with salt. And so there was plenty of water, but none of it was potable. And in conjunction with the Israeli embassy, they sent in experts. And we actually brought together local communities. So churches and schools, we would set up water distribution. And then IsraAid coordinated the trucking, the bladders, and we also found an amazing source of water that had heretofore not been used because it was a commercial water source.
On the island?
On the island. On the Grand Bahamas, there is a large commercial company called Polymers, and it makes plastic. And in order to make the plastic resin, you need tons and tons of very, very potable, highly fresh water. And right after the hurricane, they were not making plastic. So a couple of us approached Polymers and we explained to them what our need was. And they gave us thousands and thousands of gallons of water a day. And so for about 4 months, IsraAid single-handedly provided much of the potable water that got delivered to all these distribution centers. I mean, we cried just to see the people bring their water jugs, and they were able to get fresh water that they hadn't been able to access.
Wow. Wow.
I wanted to go back, but COVID hit, so I couldn't go back. So
yeah, we're going to switch. You know what? Here, let's use your segue and switch to COVID. But I'll actually start with Rachel. I wanted to ask you a little, Rachel, about is there a change in IsraAid, or am I just feeling it? Because COVID-19 has hit everybody. I mean, not everybody, sorry, everywhere around the world, some people more, some people less, but definitely now, even what we see as first world countries seem to need assistance, whether it's psychological or different assistance. We were talking to Amir about the refugees from Syria and the Middle East, and many times we talk of the lost generation of children who didn't go to school for a year or 2 years, or their education was affected. But now, we see this gap, in places in the United States, some cities in Israel, and I'm sure in other places as well, the fact that they're missing school or unable to attend a Zoom school for different reasons, but it's affecting these issues that might have been solely refugee or third world country issues are now affecting everywhere. So Rachel, if I can ask you how IsraAid has switched, and have you switched? Do you find yourself volunteering and working in places where you wouldn't have thought you would be? And of course, what are you doing?
Sure, great question. So of course, I agree. I think COVID-19 really took the world by surprise. And I'll talk a little bit about our response to COVID. we were pre-COVID on the ground in 14 countries. And when COVID struck, we decided to stay. For us, because that was very important to show our beneficiaries, to show the communities with which we work hand in hand that we are there for them. And frankly, because of our long-term approach and our community building approach, as our panelists so beautifully touched upon, we are a very trusted organization and a trusted source. And I mention that because even now, but especially when COVID-19 became a known pandemic in this world, there was a lot of misinformation, a lot of misunderstanding about what the pandemic was, about what it is. And so, believe it or not, one of the first steps that we took actually was translating a lot of World Health Organization materials into local languages. So for example, in Greece and Germany, we work with Middle Eastern populations and translated that content into Arabic, into Farsi, into French. You also heard from some of our panelists that mental health expertise and psychosocial and trauma expertise, that's also one way that IsraAid stands out as an organization. I'll backpedal for a minute and say that, of course, regardless of what your political beliefs are, Israelis have had to deal with a lot of that kind of trauma in their own borders. And so they've become experts in this field in mental health and psychosocial support and developing resilience. And so when they see crises occurring all over the world, they're, as an Israeli organization, we don't only approach with an empathy, but also with an understanding of the correlation between a crisis and the impact that it has on the psyche and that it has on people's mental health, which is very important because mental health is not always visible. So it's often a field that's overlooked. But for us, it's really what makes us stand out. It's also a gap that we fill, including during COVID-19. For example, we've been providing doctors and healthcare workers who are on the front lines now with very crucial psychosocial support, stress management, workshops, sessions, and trainings, which is very beneficial. This sounds blunt, but they're dealing with sick people, they're dealing with dying people every day. So,
and it's a different type of death. The family cannot be, I think, just to stress your point, and it's amazing that it cannot, I think the only contact the patient might have at times is the healthcare provider.
Absolutely. And so for us, it's very important to make sure that the people on the front lines, in this case, doctors, healthcare workers, et cetera, are resilient, for us to make sure that they know that they're remembered, because it's often easier sometimes just to approach the masses instead of remembering the people on the front lines working with the masses. So that's in many respects where we come into play, is supporting a lot of these communities. We work with doctors and healthcare workers in China, South Korea, and Italy. And also, frankly, in the United States, a lot of our local contacts came to IsraAid and said, hey, IsraAid, you guys are experts in the mental health field. Can you support us? This COVID-19 has taken an emotional strain on us, and it's very stressful and anxiety producing. So we developed actually a session on ways to reduce stress and anxiety, developed by our team in Israel. And approximately now 2,000 people have benefited from this virtual session. And every time we lead it, we always receive such positive feedback, including this is one of the most in-depth, best mental health sessions that we have participated in. So we're working honestly across all sectors of the community. And also, frankly, we've been providing water solutions for people. Because, as Amir—
Because of COVID, or?
Yes, so actually because of COVID. So we heard Amir and Roberto touch on this a little bit, but if you think about it, a lot of these refugees that we're working with, for example, in a refugee camp in Greece, let's say, Moria, that's designed to hold about 3,000 refugees. Yeah. We're talking about 20,000 people shoved in there, cramped in there. And, you know, they don't always have this easy access to water that we might have in the States. So this is really a privilege that we have in a way to have this easy access, to be able to respond, to be able to socially distance. As annoying as those steps seem to be, they're not always accessible to everybody. So we actually have been providing these temporary water filter systems for communities all over the world, communities in refugee camps and certain places that we work in Africa, for example. And that's also been a key response of ours. And I'll add one last point, and maybe I'll turn it over to Amir to talk about this a little bit too. But IsraAid has been responding locally in the US because unfortunately the needs are still dire, people are still going hungry. And so we've been supporting local food banks throughout California and in New Jersey because those needs are still great. So if anyone here is listening and you live in California and New Jersey and you'd like to volunteer with IsraAid and support the team, it'd be our pleasure to have you in the field. But, you know, Amir actually has been with us in Los Angeles working at one of the food banks. So if you want to share a little bit about that experience too.
Yeah, please do, Amir. And I'm not sure, but there were fires, of course, last year in California. We heard about today about really horrible fires raging again. So Amir, definitely please let us know what you're doing. And are these fires specifically affecting your work, or is it going on alongside?
There are some fires around LA that, I mean, you can totally see the smoke at this point. And I remember I think it was in 2018 when there was the fires in Northern California, IsraAid played a really meaningful role in helping the community in Northern California through brush clearance, debris removal, programs like that. And dealing with the food insecurity issues because of the pandemic has also been really meaningful. When I went to Berlin with IsraAid in 2018, I never thought my relationship with the organization would lead me to deploy in my own hometown. And leading the food distribution at the school sites alongside volunteers from the food bank, alongside volunteers from Team Rubicon, and playing that leadership role really exposed me to the dire need in our community. I never thought I would see a mile-long line of cars waiting for a box of canned goods in my hometown.
Oh, wow.
And, you know, to see the incredibly profound vulnerability of some of our more at-risk neighbors who are really hanging on by the end of a string with the economic fallout from the pandemic, really showed me how important it is for all of us to get out there and play our part. And for those who are interested in volunteering with IsraAid for the first time, it's never been easier to be a hero, because now's a chance to deploy in your own hometown and to help your own neighbors and to contribute to the incredible work that we're doing, not just as you know, an organization that reflects positively on Israel. It's always great to wear this shirt out in the field.
You're answering my next question, so
yeah,
please go on that.
You know, we're professional humanitarians. We don't do the work that we do, you know, just because it reflects positively on Israel. It's a very welcome side effect of our work that's the case. But first and foremost, we're professional humanitarians, and so the opportunity to be out there and to bring the best of Israeli know-how and Israeli ingenuity to these crises, which are sometimes so local. You know, it's very inspiring for me as a young Jewish millennial to see an Israeli organization operating in my hometown and meeting the needs of my neighbors. That's very exciting for me. And to be a part of it, you know, and to contribute, to make it feel like I'm part of this effort for this country, which is very near and dear to my heart, and to be supporting my neighbors, it's been a really rewarding experience, and really obviously meeting an urgent need in the crisis, which is it's very validating to know that the urgency of the crisis is being met in that way.
Tammy, can I ask something?
You? Please, of course.
During some of the hurricanes here in the States, IsraAid doesn't just deploy overseas. During the hurricanes, both Michael and Florence, both North Carolina and Florida, IsraAid deployed. And they deployed in conjunction with Team Rubicon, which Amir, you mentioned, which was food distribution. But the important thing is Israelis came to the US and worked alongside Team Rubicon. And these were Israelis that were recently completed with their military service. And as you know, a lot of Israelis right after their military service will travel for a year. Instead, these young Israeli men and women volunteered with IsraAid, showed up wearing the IsraAid t-shirts, and they kicked butt. I mean, they were the most requested team members on the deployments for the hurricane. And you're talking heavy work. You're talking swinging a sledgehammer, crowbars, pulling down drywall, and the evenings, because Team Rubicon has a lot of former military.
I was going to say they're also veterans.
Yes. So the Israeli veterans and the American veterans, I mean, the kind of giving that Amir, you said, brings such not only PR, but an understanding of people to people. And then when we would go out to work on the houses, these people would look at us and they would say, oh my God, you came here from Israel to help the United States. And the answer is yes, of course. So Amir, I think your point is so well taken that the need is not just overseas. Everybody has needs, and IsraAid responds.
No, absolutely. And if you say even before COVID-19, you looked at the disasters and the people and not necessarily on at geographical borders. But you did mention IsraAid and wearing the shirts, and I'll start with Roberto, but I'd love to hear from all of you just a little bit about this. Have you ever encountered either, I don't know if anti-Semitism, but somebody maybe resisting getting assistance because you're connected to an Israeli Jewish organization? Did you ever find yourself explaining or getting into tangents about the situation, maybe because of Venezuela, Colombia? Roberto, did you encounter this, or it wasn't part of your?
That is a great question, and that's a very valid question. And before I touch on that, I think I really want to highlight the partnership piece that IsraAid really hones in on. They really look for local partners to work with to validate their experience. They're not coming from a top-down approach. They're starting from a bottom-up approach. And when you start that conversation with other Latinos in our business or political or social community, and you start helping them understand that it's not about whatever political leaning you have, it's about helping the people on the ground and really seeing the work that they do through that lens. It's an exercise on helping them understand that regardless of your political leaning, this is about helping the people on the ground. And once that frame of reference is introduced and you start listing multiple examples, I think they've been in over 50 countries already, regardless of political, social, economic situations that those countries have with the United States. It really drives home the point that, this is beyond politics. This is about human to human interaction. It's about helping out your fellow human. I love what Amir said. It's never easier now than ever to be a superhero here by helping out your local human, your local individual that needs your help, especially the kids. And so when you phrase it like that, the people who might push back because of their whatever views they have start realizing it's not about their views, it's about helping people on the ground. And so you do have a need to educate and a need to highlight and a need to introduce. And I think that exercise is an exercise that we all play in as ambassadors to IsraAid, that we're very proud of being part of this organization because of the amazing work they do. And from our standpoint, or at least from my standpoint, when individuals approach us and ask us, well, they're like USAID or they list other organizations, I challenge them like, well, that's your perspective. Come join me. Come see what they do yourself. One thing is have a perspective. One thing is actually go and work at a food pantry. Let's spend a weekend, spend 4 days working through and seeing how they're affecting your local community in East LA, right? And they're like, whoa, they're in East LA? What? They just partnered with USC, and their eyes pop up, right? So it's that constant, not from a position of fear, not from a position of political ideologies, but from a position of helping out your fellow man. And once you frame the reference that way, and you have a bazillion examples, it makes it very easy for them to start seeing another perspective. And some will be receptive to that message, and some won't. But regardless of what that is, as long as you keep the goal in mind, which is this is about helping your fellow man, and these individuals will have an amazing amount of expertise when it comes to crisis management, when it comes to water filtration systems, when it comes to those type of events that affect everyone in the world. They can't help but kind of smirk and smile and say, well, yeah, you guys have a point here. Tell me more.
Yeah. Thank you very, very much for that. Rachel, if I can just continue, we said that, bringing the work of IsraAid to different places in the world and to the US, to Israel itself as well. By the way, we'll just mention that due to COVID-19, I think it's the first time ever that IsraAid is working in Israel. So, that's also an amazing story. But can you maybe, because I just noticed the time, I didn't realize we need to start wrapping up. I could talk to you guys for hours, because I need to hear from Deborah more and from Amir and from Roberto. But Rachel, can you tell us a few other places that maybe we wouldn't have expected IsraAid to work? Maybe places that don't have, in this day of optimism and hopefully, where IsraAid worked, if you can let us know a little bit.
Sure. The beauty of IsraAid is that we work with all communities, all peoples, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, nationality, because that's who we are as an organization. And frankly, we embody those values of the country, of Israel as a nation. In the past, actually, we have worked even in countries that don't have diplomatic ties with Israel. For example, we were in Indonesia responding to an earthquake and tsunami in 2018. We were even in Iraq working with ISIS victims. You've heard from Amir, we work with refugees that come from nations that don't have diplomatic ties with Israel. So all of those examples, that's because this is really who we are. And I'll just mention, one last point. We're not a diplomatic arm of the government. We're a private organization, but it is amazing to see some of these relationships form. So, for example, we were in Sierra Leone responding to the Ebola crisis. 2016, we were there until, from 2014 to 2018. And as far as I know, our work there resulted in the first ever trip from a Sierra Leonean president to Israel.
Wow.
So it is amazing. I mean, we're about the humanitarian aid. We're about helping people because it is the right thing to do. And it's amazing as a side, as Amir was saying, to see a lot of these relationships and the bridge building among all sorts of community groups that result from that.
Yeah, you said you see the long-term effects of your work and the continuing of your work. Yeah, but I think it is an added benefit if it does lead afterwards to, more ripples or more cooperation on different levels. So let me just say it was an honor for me and for us. We had Jonathan Goldman helping us as well, and Vanina Weingoldin from the public diplomacy team here at the embassy, helping us get this day. And I'm really, really happy you all made the time and made the effort to join us on World Humanitarian Day. Rachel Wallace from IsraAid will send everybody who joined us, the details to learn more about your wonderful work and organization, and to Deborah Mailman and to Amir Kashfi, right? And I'm so bad with names. And of course, to Roberto Martinez. And I hope you get to volunteer then close to home, and that, you definitely inspire us all the time. We really do follow your work, and I hope you were able to inspire through you people who are listening to volunteer with IsraAid or volunteer, period, with no, just go out there.
Thank you for this opportunity. This was wonderful today.
Yeah, really. To echo that, we're so grateful to Vanina, you, John, everybody at the embassy. And people ask me all the time, how can we promote this important work? And really, this is one reason why we're so appreciative is platforms like this that give the opportunity to share what these communities all over the world are experiencing that frankly don't really make the news. And you heard some examples here today, but we're so grateful. And if anybody else on this call after this would be interested in hosting a speaker for your community, we're happy to follow up with you as well about that.
And we'll be very, very happy to help facilitate it and connect as always. So thank you again very much, and stay healthy, stay safe. And yeah, hopefully we'll be able to see each other physically soon.
Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.